As the plane soared above the Atlantic, billionaire Garrett Langford was finalizing a $400 million merger, until he overheard a single mom calming her crying child in flawless French, then Spanish, then Mandarin. By the time she switched to her seventh language, he wasn't thinking about the deal anymore. He was staring at a woman who shouldn't have been in economy, a woman who would soon change everything he thought he knew about fate. Garrett Langford was the kind of man who didn't miss a single connection, not in the boardroom, not in his inbox, and certainly not in the air. The private jet was grounded for maintenance, so for once he was on a commercial flight. Business class, of course. He didn't like it. The seats were narrower, the noise unavoidable, and the cabin air felt recycled twice too many times. Still, he had a crucial meeting in Geneva, and a billion-dollar merger that couldn't wait for a better aircraft. He sat with his usual posture, perfectly upright, tailored navy blazer unwrinkled, tablet balanced neatly on his lap. He had been reviewing acquisition documents for the past hour, ignoring the occasional cough, baby squeal, or whisper behind him. Nothing distracted Garrett Langford when he was in business mode. Not until that sound. It began with a child's soft cry. Not unusual on a long-haul flight, but it was followed by something that made him glance up. A gentle melodic voice, female, speaking perfect French. He didn't know much of the language, but he recognized the rhythm. Then, seamlessly, the same voice transitioned into Spanish. Fluid, natural, not the choppy, hesitant cadence of someone who learned it from an app. He looked up from his screen and turned his head ever so slightly. Across the aisle, just a few rows down, sat a young woman in economy class, holding a small boy, likely 2 or 3 years old. She rocked him gently while whispering softly in his ear. Now it was Mandarin. Garrett blinked. The child calmed a bit, his sobs softening as the woman, barely older than 30, with her hair twisted into a messy bun and a pencil holding it in place, continued her tender, multilingual serenade. German came next, then Arabic, then Japanese. By the time she was cooing softly in Italian, Garrett had stopped pretending to read his screen. His attention was fully on her. This wasn't something you heard every day. It wasn't something you heard ever. Not like this. The woman wasn't showing off. She wasn't performing. She didn't even seem aware anyone was listening. She was simply a mother doing everything she could to soothe her child in midair. And in doing so, she'd accidentally revealed a secret world. The flight attendant passed by, and Garrett raised his hand slightly. "Excuse me," he said with quiet authority. "That woman, row 14C. Do you know who she is?" The attendant blinked. "Ms. Carter, I believe. Traveling with her son. That's all I know, sir." Garrett nodded slowly, thoughtful. "Miss Carter." As the plane settled into a long stretch of quiet cruising, Garrett found himself unable to look away. He watched as the woman pulled out a worn coloring book and helped her son scribble carefully in the lines. Her movements were precise, patient, the kind of patience born from exhaustion and love. He checked his tablet again, but his mind wasn't on mergers anymore. 7 languages. Who was she? And what was she doing in economy class with a 2-year-old and a backpack with duct tape holding the zipper closed? The hum of the engines continued. The documents on his screen blurred. Garrett Langford, billionaire, innovator, and one of the most focused minds in the tech industry, had just encountered the one thing he hadn't accounted for on this flight, a mystery worth far more than money. And he had no idea that this chance moment at 35,000 feet would alter both their lives forever. Garrett spent the next 2 hours pretending to work, while secretly stealing glances across the aisle. There was something about the woman, Ms. Carter, the attendant had said, that pulled at his attention in a way no investor pitch or quarterly report ever had. She was unlike anyone he'd encountered, and Garrett had met presidents, royalty, and the brightest minds in Silicon Valley. She wasn't just multilingual. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that suggested she had once lived a very different life than the one she was living now. The child, a boy with big hazel eyes and a mop of chestnut curls, eventually drifted off to sleep on her lap. She leaned back, eyes closed, her hand resting gently on his back. Her coat was frayed at the sleeves. Her shoes were practical, clean, but old. There were no signs of luxury or indulgence. Nothing about her matched the seven-language fluency Garrett had just witnessed. Something didn't add up. He wasn't trying to be invasive, but his mind was trained to analyze, connect, and decipher patterns. And this woman was a riddle. Unable to resist, Garrett opened his secure laptop and connected to his assistant back in New York via encrypted chat. Need a quiet background check. Passenger on same flight. Name: Sloan Mavis Carter, row 14C. With child. See what you can find. The reply came quickly. His assistant, Violet, never questioned these things. She was used to Garrett's sudden curiosities, though even she added a brief, "Is this personal?" He ignored the question. 15 minutes later, the preliminary info arrived. Garrett scrolled through the summary with increasing disbelief. Born in New Orleans, daughter of missionaries, lived in over a dozen countries by the time she was 18, fluent in multiple languages, confirmed. Attended 2 international schools, graduated top of her class, accepted to Georgetown, but deferred and never enrolled. A few years later, there was a note of a missed fellowship at the United Nations. Then, the records thinned out. Garrett frowned. Instead of an upward trajectory into diplomacy or academia, Sloan had taken a job as a local interpreter in Sacramento. Later, a part-time position at a community center. Then nothing but a string of administrative and retail jobs. Temporary, low-paying, mostly within a 20-mile radius. Recently filed for housing assistance, single mother, no known spouse or partner. It was a steep drop for someone of her background, a free fall. He sat back and stared at her again. She shifted in her seat, pulling her child's blanket up around his shoulders. Her lips moved slightly, repeating a phrase in what sounded like Dutch, and then she smiled sadly as the boy murmured something in return. She wasn't just brilliant. She was lost to the world, forgotten by it. A sudden voice came over the speaker system announcing they were beginning their descent into JFK. Garrett's pulse quickened. He hadn't thought this far ahead. He couldn't just walk up to her, introduce himself, and start asking questions. He wasn't a journalist, and he definitely wasn't a stranger without an angle. He was Garrett Langford, CEO of Langtech Systems, and one of the most influential entrepreneurs in America. If he approached her directly, she'd be wary, defensive, or worse, think he had some ulterior motive. He needed to be thoughtful. As the seatbelt sign pinged overhead, Sloan began gently waking her son. Garrett watched her pack their things, meticulous, efficient. She wiped the boy's face with a cloth, tucked a notebook into her worn backpack, and quietly waited for the final announcements. No phone, no earbuds, no scrolling through apps. Just presence. As if she didn't expect the world to offer her anything except what she brought herself. The aircraft touched down with a soft jolt, tires screeching briefly before easing into the taxiway. Garrett made a decision. He'd exit first, wait just outside the gate. Not with a pitch, not with a proposition, but with a simple gesture. If she didn't want to talk, fine. But he had to try. This wasn't about romance or fascination. It was deeper than that. Garrett felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. A stirring of responsibility, of curiosity, of wonder. And as he stood to gather his briefcase, he glanced back one more time and saw her struggling to lift her son while reaching for their bag overhead. A man nearby offered no help. No one even looked. Garrett moved forward, halfway down the aisle already, but his hands clenched the seat in front of him. This world didn't deserve people like her to go unnoticed, and he wasn't going to let it. Garrett waited just outside the gate, standing slightly off to the side so he wouldn't seem intrusive. Passengers spilled into the terminal, dragging their suitcases and checking their phones, faces drained from the long flight. He glanced at his watch, but didn't really register the time. His eyes were fixed on the corridor where Sloane would emerge. 100 things rushed through his mind. How to start a conversation, whether to introduce himself by name or let her lead, what to say if she was suspicious. He was never nervous meeting world leaders or billion-dollar partners, yet now, his fingers tapped anxiously against his carry-on. Then she appeared. Sloane stepped into the terminal holding her son on one hip, her backpack awkwardly slung over her other shoulder. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not for anyone in particular, just assessing, calculating like someone used to navigating new territory. Garrett immediately noticed the fatigue behind her composure. Miles clung to her neck, half asleep, and she looked like she hadn't had a proper rest in weeks. He stepped forward. "Need a hand?" he asked gently, his voice controlled but warm. She paused. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, wary but polite. "I've got it, thank you." "I was on the flight," he added quickly, sensing her hesitation. "I couldn't help but notice how incredible you were with your son, the way you calmed him. In 7 languages, no less." She gave a short laugh, more of a breath. "That obvious, huh?" "Hard to miss," he smiled. "That's not something most people can do, or even attempt." She adjusted her grip on Miles and lowered him slightly to let him stand. He clung to her leg now, thumb in his mouth. She shifted her weight to ease the strain on her back. Garrett offered his hand. "Garrett Langford." The moment he said his name, he saw recognition flicker across her face. A pause. Not fear, not awe, but understanding. She knew who he was. Everyone in the tech world did. "Sloane?" she said simply. "Sloane Carter." "It's very nice to meet you, Sloane," he said, letting the silence between them breathe. "Do you have a few minutes? There's a cafe just over there. I'd really like to ask you something, and I promise it's not some kind of business pitch." She hesitated. He saw the calculation behind her eyes, her mind clearly scanning every angle. She glanced at her son, then back at him. "I don't know," she said cautiously. "I'm not really in the habit of getting coffee with strangers at airports, even if they're billionaires." Garrett chuckled. "Fair enough. What if I told you I wasn't asking as a billionaire, just as a man who overheard something extraordinary and wants to understand the story behind it?" She tilted her head slightly as if deciding whether to call his bluff. Then, to his surprise, she gave a small nod. 10 minutes, she said, but only because I could use something hot before we get back on the train. Deal. He led her to a quiet corner of a cafe near the windows, motioned for her to sit, and offered to take her order. She asked for chamomile tea and a small hot chocolate for Miles. Garrett returned with their drinks, placing them carefully on the table. Sloane sipped her tea, eyes still cautious but softening. "So, what is it you wanted to ask, Mr. Langford?" He leaned forward, arms folded lightly on the table. "How does someone like you, someone with the ability to speak 7 languages, end up living under the radar?" She smiled wryly. "You checked, didn't you?" He didn't deny it. "Yes." She didn't seem offended. If anything, she seemed amused. "I guess it makes sense. Men like you don't approach women like me unless they've done their homework." "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," Garrett said honestly. "It's just your talent, your presence. It doesn't match your circumstances, and that bothers me." Her expression darkened slightly. "What do you want me to say? That life didn't go the way I planned? That sometimes talent isn't enough? That the world doesn't care how many languages you speak when you're a single mother with no support system?" He was quiet. He could feel the pain behind her words, sharp, unfiltered, unpolished. "I was supposed to go to Georgetown," she continued, voice steadier now. "Had a full ride. Then my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. I put school on hold to take care of her. When she died, I went home, got a job. I met someone. He left when I got pregnant. I've been trying to stay afloat ever since. Some days just surviving is all I can manage." Garrett's throat tightened. He hadn't expected that level of honesty so quickly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Sloane gave a tired smile. "Don't be. I'm not a tragedy. I have my son, and I've learned more about patience and resilience than any university could teach me." He looked at her differently now. She wasn't just brilliant, she was unbreakable. Garrett took a slow breath. Sloane, if I said I might have a way for you to use your gift again, on your terms, with real impact, would you even believe me? She narrowed her eyes. That depends. What's the catch? No catch, he said. Just one person in this world noticing you and wanting to help you be seen. And for the first time since they met, Sloane looked genuinely surprised. Not skeptical, not defensive, just stunned into silence. Garrett left the airport with Sloane and Miles still on his mind. He had made the offer sincerely, without a hidden agenda, but he hadn't expected how deeply their conversation would affect him. The way she spoke, measured, thoughtful, with sharp intelligence behind every word, stayed with him even more than her linguistic abilities. She had given him only a brief window into her life, yet he saw in her something he rarely saw in anyone anymore. Raw, untapped brilliance buried under layers of hardship. That night, from his penthouse overlooking Manhattan, Garrett sat alone in his study, replaying every moment of their airport conversation. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened, and he didn't want to let it go. He pulled up a blank file and typed her name, Sloane Mavis Carter. Then he started sketching a plan. He wasn't going to offer her a handout. That would insult her dignity. But he could create an opportunity, something real, something tailored to her rare skills. His tech company had recently launched a global initiative for language-based AI systems in humanitarian aid, translation software, real-time communication for relief workers, educational tools for refugee children. It was cutting edge, and it needed someone who not only understood languages but understood people. Their needs, their rhythms, their fears. Sloane was perfect for it. The next morning, Garrett called an emergency meeting with the AI development team. His staff, used to his unconventional bursts of inspiration, didn't even blink when he proposed a new consulting role. Remote, flexible, child accommodating, and extremely well compensated. He even instructed legal to make the offer anonymous at first, so she wouldn't feel pressured. Meanwhile, in Sacramento, Sloane was back in her apartment, a small second-floor unit in an aging complex with peeling paint and paper-thin walls. She sat at the kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills and a box of crayons. Miles was on the floor humming to himself, building towers out of cereal boxes and plastic cups. The trip to New York had been hard, expensive. The job interview she flew out for had already sent a rejection email before she even landed back home. Her savings were nearly gone. She hadn't told anyone, but she was 3 weeks behind on rent. The landlord had given her a deadline, August 1st, or she and Miles would be out. When the email landed in her inbox, she didn't recognize the sender. Subject, language consultant position, private AI research project. She clicked it, expecting spam or some vague gig work, but what she read made her sit upright. A research opportunity involving real-world language implementation in humanitarian fields. 7 languages required. Remote participation. High-level decision-making involvement. 6-month trial contract with renewal possibility. Monthly compensation, $12,000. Fully prepaid travel and equipment stipend included. Her eyes filled with tears before she realized it. She reread the message 6 times. She didn't believe it. It had to be a mistake. Or worse, a scam. But the name at the bottom was a legit executive at Lang Tech Systems. She Googled the number provided. It matched. The email domain was real. The project mentioned in the attachment was real too. It even linked to press releases from the UN and several tech magazines. Still, her fingers hovered over the reply button. Why her? How did they find her? And who would ever believe that someone like her, a woman barely staying afloat, would get an offer like this? Then she thought of Garrett. Number that was impossible. He didn't even take her number. He didn't ask for contact information. He couldn't have, unless he already knew. Sloane's chest tightened. Was this pity disguised as opportunity? A billionaire playing savior, She stood up and paced the kitchen. She didn't want charity, but this didn't sound like charity. It sounded like someone had seen her value and was finally offering her a place to prove it. She looked at Miles, now asleep on the couch, a crayon still clutched in his hand. Then she sat down again, took a breath, and typed a reply. I accept. When do we begin? Back in New York, Garrett read her response the moment it came in. His chest swelled, not with pride, but with relief. He hadn't scared her away. She'd said yes. He closed his laptop and stepped onto his balcony, the night wind brushing past him. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was saving a project or rescuing a company. This time he was doing something better. He was rescuing a future that should have never been lost in the first place. Sloane's first weeks with the project felt like waking up from a long, heavy sleep. The company shipped her a brand new laptop, a microphone headset, and a secure interface to access LangTech's multilingual AI sandbox environment. She set up her workspace at the corner of her kitchen, where the natural light hit just right in the morning, and where she could still keep an eye on Miles while he played or colored nearby. From the very first call, it was clear this was not a token position. The project leads didn't patronize her. They listened. She joined daily strategy meetings with developers from Zurich, linguists from Cairo, and engineers from Seoul. Every time she spoke, whether it was to explain tonal nuances in Arabic dialects or the difference in emotional expression between Mandarin and Cantonese, people took notes, real notes, and asked questions. Some even reached out afterward to say, I never thought of that before. She found herself falling into a rhythm she hadn't felt since her teenage years. Before her mother got sick. Before she became someone the world forgot. Each morning she woke up early, made pancakes or oatmeal for Miles, and opened her laptop while he played nearby. When the meetings were done, she worked on recordings and feedback reports. She didn't even mind staying up late some nights, fine-tuning her commentary on translations for child evacuation warnings in war zones, or redesigning a script that taught volunteers how to speak to frightened refugees. But it wasn't just the work. It was the respect. The quiet messages from people across the world who said things like, your phrasing helped this woman in Kenya explain her injuries to a doctor. Or, your tone suggestion reduced miscommunication in our chatbot by 27%. That meant everything to Sloane. Miles also blossomed. With a little more money, she enrolled him in a half-day Montessori program. He came home talking about music and plants, and he started greeting her in different languages, trying to mimic what he heard on her calls. But still, she hadn't heard from Garrett. She wasn't sure if it was better or worse that he stayed silent. A part of her wanted to reach out, to thank him, to ask why, but another part of her feared what she might feel if she saw him again. This wasn't a fairy tale. She had a life now, a real one. She couldn't afford to get distracted by fantasies, even if he had been the catalyst for all of it. Then one day, 3 weeks in, a package arrived. It wasn't addressed from LangTech, it was hand-delivered. Inside the brown wrapping paper was a children's book. Worn, old, clearly read hundreds of times. Its title was in 7 languages across the front. Inside the front cover, there was a note, written in clean, slanted script. Dear Sloane, I remembered this from when I was young. My father used to read it to me in German, though I never understood most of it. I always wished someone could explain it in English. I imagine Miles already knows all 7 languages by now. Congratulations on everything you've built. G. Sloane stared at the page, her fingers trembling slightly. G. Garrett. She turned the book in her hands and smiled. That night she read the story to Miles in every language printed on the cover. The boy giggled each time the words changed, resting his head on her lap as she spoke. She closed the book, kissed his forehead, and sat in the quiet for a long time afterward. She finally understood what Garrett had done. He hadn't pushed himself into her new world. He'd stayed out of it, quietly. He hadn't gifted her a golden bridge. He'd just opened the gate and let her walk through on her own. She took out her phone and drafted a message. I received the book, thank you. It meant more than you know. And so does the silence, but when you're back in California, I'd like to return the gesture. Over coffee, maybe. My treat this time. She stared at it for a moment, then hit send. She didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the future. She was building it. One word, one voice, one language at a time. Garrett didn't reply right away. Sloane had checked her phone more times than she cared to admit in the days that followed. Each time the message remained read, but unanswered. She tried not to let it bother her. She reminded herself that she didn't need validation, especially not from the man who had already opened the door to a new life for her. Still, a small ache formed in her chest each time she scrolled past his name in her inbox. Meanwhile, the project at Langtech was accelerating. Sloane was no longer just a contributor. She was becoming the cornerstone of the team's human-centric design. Her suggestions led to an overhaul of the system's empathy algorithms. Field agents using the program in refugee camps reported fewer misunderstandings, faster intake processes, and even moments of emotional connection that wouldn't have been possible without her phrasing and tone calibration. People were being seen, truly seen, in their own languages, and it was because of her. One afternoon, while recording emotional variants for Spanish dialects used in Colombia versus those used in Mexico, Sloane received a video call from Langtech's director of applied AI. He looked flustered, but excited. "We've got a situation," he said, half laughing, half panicked. "The UN requested a live demo of the Refugee Response Assistant in Geneva in 10 days. Sloane blinked. "A live demo? Why me?" "Because they want the architect of the tone design to do it." "And Sloane, you're the architect." Her heart pounded. "Geneva? 10 days?" "I haven't traveled abroad since before Miles was born," she whispered. "They'll pay for everything, and your son is welcome to travel with you. We'll even provide a sitter during the presentation if you want. Just say yes." Sloane felt dizzy. This was the kind of opportunity she had once dreamed of. The kind that had seemed so far gone she buried the hope years ago. She looked over at Miles, asleep on the couch with marker smudges on his fingers, and a blanket kicked halfway to the floor. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, "I'll do it." The next 10 days flew by in a blur. Passport renewals, fittings for professional attire, presentation drafts and rehearsals with the technical team. She worked late into the night, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of exhaustion. She felt purpose. On the day of departure, she and Miles boarded the flight to Switzerland. He was fascinated by the airport lights and asked 100 questions. She answered each in a different language, grinning every time he tried to repeat them. He called her Professor Mommy, and the title made her laugh until tears came. The night before the presentation, she stood on the balcony of the hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, a glass of water in her hand, her nerves on fire. She glanced down at her phone one last time, still hoping for a message from Garrett. Nothing. But instead of disappointment, she felt a strange kind of peace. Maybe he had stepped back for a reason. Maybe she wasn't meant to need him anymore, and maybe that was the greatest gift he could have given her. The morning of the presentation, the UN hall buzzed with people, diplomats, developers, NGO leaders. She stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to her collar, heart thudding in her chest. She had been here once before, when she was 17, delivering a student speech at an international youth summit. She remembered how invincible she felt then. That memory had faded after life took over, but now that girl was returning. When the announcer introduced her, she stepped onto the stage, not as a charity case, not as a struggling mother, but as the mind behind a program set to reshape humanitarian communication. She began in English, then transitioned smoothly into Arabic, then Spanish, then Mandarin, each language interwoven with examples of how real people had been impacted by the software. The crowd leaned in closer with each shift. Some nodded, some smiled. One woman in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek. At the end, Sloane concluded in French, her voice unwavering. When people feel heard, they remember they are human. And when we speak their language, not just their words, but their hearts, we remind them they still matter. The applause was immediate, loud, sustained. Sloane stood motionless for a moment, overwhelmed. As she turned to exit the stage, a familiar voice came from the shadows. That was breathtaking. She froze. Garrett stepped forward, dressed sharply in a dark suit, no tie. His eyes were softer than she remembered. He held something in his hand. A red and gold badge that read, Langtech Special Advisor. You came, she whispered. I never left, he said quietly. I just wanted to see if you'd fly on your own. Tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hug him or hit him. Instead, she laughed through the tears and said, You could have at least texted. He smiled. I thought the story would be better this way. She didn't argue. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that this wasn't about being rescued. This was about finally being met as an equal, and something deep inside her clicked into place. After the presentation, the floodgates opened. Sloane found herself swarmed by UN delegates, NGO representatives, tech executives, and humanitarian leaders, all eager to speak with her. Handshakes, compliments, invitations to panels, and even offers of partnership came at her from every direction. She handled it all gracefully, though her head spun with the sudden shift. Only hours earlier she had been coaching Miles through his fear of hotel elevators. Now people were calling her a global voice for ethical technology. But through it all, her eyes kept drifting back to Garrett. He stood just out of the spotlight, speaking quietly with one of the Langtech engineers, occasionally glancing her way. There was something unspoken between them, something waiting for the right moment. And that moment came when the crowd finally thinned, and a staff member ushered her into the green room for a few minutes of rest before the closing ceremony. He followed. She was sitting with her heels off, sipping water and trying to steady her breath when he stepped inside. His presence filled the room, not because of wealth or status, but because of something deeper: regret, admiration, emotion. I should have replied to your message, Garrett said gently, closing the door behind him. But the truth is, I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to become the center of a story that was meant to be yours. You were never the center, she said softly, standing. But you were the spark, and I think that scared you more than it did me. He looked down for a second, then back at her. It did. I've spent my whole life fixing things with money. But you didn't need fixing. You just needed a chance. Sloane stepped closer. And you gave me that, quietly, kindly, without making it about you. That matters, Garrett. He looked at her, and for the first time since they met, his mask was completely gone. He wasn't the composed billionaire or the strategic mind behind empires. He was just a man standing in front of the woman who had changed how he saw the world. I didn't want to interfere, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I've thought about you every day since that flight. She searched his face. So why now? Why show up today? Garrett took a step forward. Because today the world saw you the way I saw you the moment I heard your voice. And I couldn't miss that. I couldn't sit on the other side of the world and watch someone else hand you the microphone. There was silence between them, thick with meaning. Then Sloane laughed. A soft, rich laugh that melted the last walls still standing between them. You're lucky I'm in a good mood, she teased. Or I might have thrown this water bottle at you for ghosting me. Garrett smiled, stepping even closer. I'll accept the risk. She looked up at him. So what now? You show up in Geneva, deliver a dramatic line, then disappear again? No, he said, shaking his head. I don't want to disappear again. I want to stay, if you'll let me. Her heart pounded, not from fantasy or rescue, but from something real. This wasn't about saviors or fairy tales anymore. It was about two people who had seen each other completely, flaws, fears, brilliance, and still wanted to walk forward together. She reached for his hand. We'll start with dinner, she said, and you'll meet Miles again, this time as a friend. Friend? He asked, eyes glinting. She smirked. Let's not rush it. I'm the one with the power now, remember? He laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true, and he'd never been more grateful for it. Back at the hotel, Miles ran to the door when he saw his mother. Garrett knelt down beside her, and the boy tilted his head in curiosity. You look familiar, Miles said, narrowing his eyes. I'm the guy from the plane, Garrett replied, smiling. Remember? The one who gave your mom a coffee. Miles nodded seriously. You were watching us. Garrett laughed. That's true, you two were hard to miss. Miles turned to his mom. Is he staying? Sloane looked down at Garrett, then back at her son. For now, she said, placing her hand on Garrett's shoulder. If he behaves. Garrett met her gaze, humbled, grateful. I promise I will. And with that, something subtle but unbreakable shifted in the room. Not the beginning of a romance or the end of a struggle, but the start of something even rarer. A partnership built on respect, truth, and the quiet strength of being seen. 3 months after the Geneva presentation, Sloane stood in a conference room on the 41st floor of Langtech's headquarters in San Francisco, surrounded by glass, light, and a team of executives who now referred to her as Director Carter. The title still felt surreal. It wasn't something she had asked for. It had been offered unanimously by the board after the success of the humanitarian AI launch, which now had pilot programs running in over 20 countries. But even more than the title, what moved her was the legacy she was building. She had helped create a tool that didn't just speak to people, but listened to them. Refugees, victims of disaster, children in war zones, they were now being understood in their own languages, with dignity and care. And for once it was her voice, her intuition, that had led the way. After the final meeting of the day, she walked down to the company's on-site childcare center. Miles was sitting cross-legged on a bright green mat, showing another child how to say thank you in Swahili. When he saw her, he leapt to his feet and ran into her arms. Mommy, he cried, we learned 6 new words today. Just 6? She teased. You're slipping. He giggled and buried his face in her shoulder. They left the building together as the California sun began to set, the sky painted in streaks of gold and deep lavender. Outside, a black SUV waited at the curb. Garrett leaned against it, hands in his pockets, smiling that quiet, respectful smile she had come to cherish. He opened the door for them without a word and helped Miles buckle into his booster seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, Garrett glanced at Sloane. You have a speech tomorrow in D.C. for the State Department. You ready? She nodded. Finished it last night. Short, clean, heart first. Good, he said, then added, you'll have dinner with the Secretary of Education. They're considering using your emotional tone software in public school systems. Sloane's breath caught. That had been her secret hope for months. That's incredible, she whispered. You made it happen, Garrett said. They rode in silence for a few moments, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who know there's no longer anything to prove. When they pulled into the driveway of the small modern home they had found together just outside the city, Miles was already dozing off in the back seat. Garrett carried him inside while Sloane unlocked the door. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around the space that now felt like more than shelter. It was a home, built not on wealth or status, but trust. She walked into the kitchen, pulled down 2 mugs, and started heating milk the way Garrett liked it. Honey, cinnamon, and a hint of cardamom. He'd introduced it to her the night after Geneva, and now it had become part of their rhythm. When he came in and set Miles gently on the couch, she handed him the mug. He took it with a smile. You never asked me why I really came to Geneva, he said softly. She leaned against the counter. I assumed it was because you believed in the work. I did, but that's not why I came. He turned toward her, eyes open and vulnerable. I came because I realized that somewhere along the way I stopped building things that mattered. I created systems, companies, empires, but nothing that looked me in the eye and told me I had made a real difference. Then I met you, and suddenly I wanted to build again, but this time with someone who actually sees people. Sloane felt her throat tighten. She set her mug down carefully, then stepped closer to him. I never wanted to be rescued, she said quietly. I know, he replied. That's why I fell for you. She smiled. Not the tight, polite smile she used to survive the world, but the real one. The one that came from the woman she used to be, and had finally become again. He reached for her hand and she let him. Later that night, after Miles was tucked in and the house was quiet, they sat on the back porch under the stars. There were no deals to negotiate, no meetings to prepare for, just two people who had once sat on opposite sides of the world, now sharing the same future. And as the wind carried the faint sound of laughter from a neighboring house, Sloane looked up at the sky and whispered something in French. "What did you say?" Garrett asked, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She turned to him, eyes sparkling. "I said sometimes the universe speaks, and if you listen closely enough, you just might understand that it's been speaking your language all along." Garrett kissed her gently. And somewhere, far from boardrooms and billion-dollar mergers, a life not of power but of purpose had begun. In my opinion, the ending of this story is not just satisfying, it's deeply meaningful. It avoids the easy tropes of a fairy tale rescue or overnight success, and instead delivers something much more powerful. Transformation through recognition, respect, and second chances. Sloane didn't need saving. She needed to be seen. And Garrett, for all his resources, wasn't her savior. He was simply the person who stopped long enough to notice her brilliance when the rest of the world passed her by. That's what makes their connection so authentic. It's not rooted in wealth or power, but in mutual growth, humility, and a shared desire to do something good. The true beauty of the ending is that it honors both the individual and the relationship. Sloane steps into her full potential on her own terms, and Garrett rediscovers his humanity through her. Their love isn't loud or dramatic. It's steady, honest, and earned. It's a reminder that sometimes the most life-changing moments don't come with fanfare, but with a quiet voice on a plane speaking 7 languages, and one man who truly listened.